Hello and welcome to another edition of News Analysis with me, Homa Lesgi. On this program, we're looking into the latest cause of tension between the U.S. and Venezuela. Almost as soon as Hugo Chavez said he wouldn't allow Larry Palmer to enter Venezuela as the U.S. ambassador, Washington responded by revoking the visa of Venezuela's envoy to the U.S. Was it a hasty approach, and where will it leave the already strained ties between the U.S. and one of its major oil suppliers? First, let's take a look at this report.
Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez earlier this month opposed the U.S. pick for its ambassador to Caracas, Larry Palmer.
Whenever you see a North American ambassador, you see a conspirator, an intriguer, a spy, and all those who work with them. That's why I told Foreign Minister Nicolas Maduro, and we already released a statement. Mr. Palmer will not enter here.
Chavez also urged Venezuelan authorities to, quote, grab Palmer if they saw him at the Caracas airport. Palmer, a former U.S. ambassador to Honduras, angered Chavez after he told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the Venezuelan army has low morale and that members of the government have clear ties with terrorist organizations in neighboring Colombia. Chavez's decision to reject Palmer has drawn retaliation from Washington, which revoked the visa of Venezuela's ambassador to Washington. The U.S. State Department says Caracas should only blame itself for the situation. So how will Washington's move to revoke the Venezuelan ambassador's visa affect the already strained relations between the two countries?
Well, let's hear more on this now from Professor Stephen Hart, Head of Latin American Studies in University College London, joining us live from London. Sarah Flounders, National Co-Director of the International Action Centre in New York, and Peter Bourne, a former advisor to former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, joining us on the line from Oxford. I'd like to welcome you all to this edition of News Analysis. I'll start with Mr. Stephen Hart. Mr. Hart, critics in Venezuela have called the U.S. reaction unjustified. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't think it's unjustified. I think it's actually rather inevitable. In some ways, by actually specifically referring to Larry Palmer and doing something that's been done actually quite frequently by Venezuela, in other words, accusing the representative of the United States a spy, etc. There's been a lot of hostility over the years. With regard between Venezuela and the United States, and I think it was quite inevitable that this would happen. I think the interesting thing about this is whether it escalates beyond that. It happened in 2008. It happened in 2006. In other words, it was a tit-for-tat kind of grandstanding between the two countries. You know, we'll send back your diplomat, you send back ours, and then there'll be a kind of a freeze in diplomatic relations for a while until things sort of sort themselves out. The interesting thing here is that the representative, the US representative of the House, has said that there are a variety of options they're looking at. Now, that's quite interesting, there's a variety of options, because one wonders whether that means not just a diplomatic freeze, as it were, but also some re-evaluation of the trade relations between the two countries. It's well known that Venezuela provides a great deal of crude oil. In fact, it's the fifth largest a supplier of crude oil to the United States, and one wonders whether that's going to be reviewed. I mean, that might seem a rather large step, but it's interesting that there was a comment, there's a variety of options.
Right, let's go to Sarah now in New York. Sarah, if it is Venezuela's legal right to accept or reject a foreign envoy, why should the US respond like this? I mean, Stephen there saying that he expected such a response. What do you think?
Well, U.S. policy again and again has been a policy of making threats and counter-threats. Now, Venezuela has every right to insist and demand, as President Chavez has said, on respect. Venezuela has been a victim of U.S. coups d'etats and attempted coups. President Chavez himself of a direct U.S.-sponsored coup in 2002. So for an ambassador to be named who is really discussing discussing Venezuelan military loyalty, morale, this is really a discussion of the potential of a new coup in Venezuela. And so Venezuela quite rightfully rejected this ambassador and has insisted on relations of mutual respect. And this is what the U.S. is signaling. They are unwilling to allow with any of the countries of Latin America or the countries of the developing world.
So, Sarah, would you agree with this analysis that the growing U.S. aggressiveness towards the Venezuelan, Bolivian and Ecuadorian government is because of its diminishing influence over the Latin American and Caribbean area, which Washington sees, of course, as its own backyard?
Very much so. Each of these countries, first of all, by connecting to each other economically, politically, through the ALBA Accords and through developing trade relations with other countries around the world who are also determined to pursue their sovereignty and their national rights, is no longer directly under the thumb of the U.S. Corporate power and U.S. military power. And that certainly is infuriating to U.S. policymakers, to the Pentagon, and to the corporations that are used to treating the economies of Latin America as extensions, as sources of cheap raw material and cheap labor. And these countries are very much standing up for themselves, for their national rights, and for the rights of their total population.
Okay, let's get in the view of Peter Bourne now, joining us on the phone from Oxford. Peter, some critics say Washington's insistence to send Palmer, despite Venezuela's clear opposition, appears to be an effort to provoke a rupture in diplomatic relations. Is the White House, do you think, pursuing a brinksmanship tactic here?
Well, I'm not sure that they're particularly doing that. I in general, agree with what Professor Hart said and Sarah Flounders. I think it's a deliberately provocative act to nominate an ambassador who is clearly in opposition to the government that he would be going to work with. The tit for tat is a fairly traditional ploy in international diplomacy. So the fact that when Venezuela would not accept Brad Palmer, the U.S. would reject and ask the ambassador of Venezuela to leave. This is sort of standard operating procedure in diplomacy. But there are two very sad things about this. One is that when he came to power, Obama said he was going to reach out and work closely with people like Chavez. In fact, it's the same old policy. The issue of refusing to really recognize the sovereignty of nations that traditionally have been under the domination of the U.S. And then the other unfortunate thing is that the Venezuelan ambassador in Washington, Ambassador Alvarez, is one of the most respected foreign ambassadors in Washington. He is able to articulate the Venezuelan position extremely well. He's regarded as a very distinguished figure. So for Venezuela to lose his presence in Washington is very unfortunate. I suspect that this will not escalate particularly, but it will just continue to smolder on because there are forces in the U.S. government that just want to be critical and try to subvert all of these popularly elected leaders in Latin America, whether it's in Uruguay or Ecuador or Bolivia. The U.S. Really does not want to accept democracy in these countries if they accept people who are not going to be completely pliant with the U.S.